Nuclear annihilation is bad, but preventing it is expensive. If only there was an organization that could not only reinforce our national security, but also save the government money and maybe even lead humanity to interplanetary colonization. Hi, I'm Rantilla, and today we're discussing Space Force. So what is Space Force? To start, Space Force has nothing to do with NASA, Star Trek, or fighting aliens. In June of 2018, President Trump declared that he was creating a sixth branch of the military dedicated to space, aptly named Space Force. This seemingly wild proposition flew the media into a frenzy of both admiration and derogation. And while it may seem ridiculous or at bare minimum unnecessary, Space Force is real and could have some interesting and practical benefits. But what would a Space Force look like? In essence, Space Force is nothing more than a funding reorganization. A study by the Government Accountability Office discovered that authority over space is distributed across over 60 different organizations in the federal government. Similarly, the Office for Management and Funding concluded that money for said space programs was spread out just as chaotically. Areas such as the Air Force, Navy, Army, as well as intelligence organizations such as the National Reconnaissance Office are all benefactors of these funds. Space Force would be a merging of these various space programs' manpower, funds, and resources into a single organization dealing with all things space. This is not a new concept. As far back as 1997, when space was far less prevalent in our civilian lifestyle as well as military operations, the idea of a single space organization was already getting tossed around congressional committees. An earlier report by the Rumsfeld Space Commission even pushed for the creation of a Space Corps, a smaller version of Space Force under the jurisdiction of the Air Force. But why bother? The reasoning behind Space Force can be broken down into three different categories: military, finances, and technology. Let's start with military. As we speak, there are billions of dollars of equipment floating around defenselessly in space. These various satellites have various purposes. Some are used for transmitting information, such as satellite TV and military communications. Others are used for reconnaissance and observation like Google Earth, or again, military purposes such as surveillance. Regardless of who put them up there and why, they're absolute sitting ducks. A report by the Rumsfeld Commission, a government-backed study into the distribution of space resources within the federal government, went so far as to say that the United States is an attractive candidate for a Space Pearl Harbor, meaning that we are susceptible to a surprise attack that could knock out billions of dollars of space equipment. And other rival nations are well aware of this. The Center for Strategic and International Studies issued in their report titled Space Threat Assessment 2018 that knocking out space communication systems is one of the first steps of theoretical battle plans in countries like China and Russia. Plus, when one takes into account the growing international tensions, such as the dissolution of the INF Treaty, the threat becomes a lot more prominent. So how would a Space Force solve the issue? Establishing a Space Force would allow America to have a defensive military presence able to defend civilian, intelligence, and non-combative interests in space. And even if Space Force was only granted trivial amounts of funding, it would still be worth it for the decrease of reaction time in case of an emergency. Because when you have all your space people in the same department, things move a lot faster than when they're distributed across the country. Now, some may be concerned about the legality of weapon systems in space. The United Nations international law permits military presence in space as long as they aren't equipped with nuclear weapons or weapons of mass destruction. In other words, any sort of defensive apparatus that could fit on a rocket would be more than legal. Another issue that Space Force solves is the issue of space sidelining. The current military branches with space programs, the Army, Navy, and Air Force, view space as a secondary domain as opposed to their traditional ones of the land, sea, and air, respectively. And this makes sense. If you're in the Navy, you'll probably focus on defending the water as opposed to space. Space Force's primary domain would be space, thus negating the possibility of it being overlooked as a terrain for military opportunity. Moving along to economic benefits, Space Force is an economically positive investment. Remember I said consolidating space resources would aid in reaction time? The same concept applies to funding. Having one space organization means that capital that would otherwise go towards maintaining bureaucracies of the fragmented space programs can be refocused into working on tasks within Space Force such as research and development, or go to other places in the government entirely. Another problem is that with the fragmented system, space professionals get tossed from department to department and never get a chance to settle and specialize. This hinders potential advancements and is an overall loss of efficiency. With Space Force, all of these professionals are together working collectively, as opposed to just performing rudimentary tasks that are viewed as secondary by the organizations that control them anywho. And it's a coalescing of these space heads that can lead to the real good stuff. One interesting thought is the implications that Space Force could have on technological advancement. The United States military budget for 2019 is $716 billion. If Space Force were to receive 5% of that, it would be receiving double the funding of NASA. Space Force, like all military branches, would have a designated research and development program dedicated to developing new technologies to aid on the battlefield. One can only speculate on how, if private companies such as SpaceX can create leaps in rocket technology in just a few years, what could the organization, efficiency, and funding of the US military create if its focus was diverted to the same goals? Some technologies at the top of the list would be satellites capable of defending against or destroying ICBMs. But following that, we could see anything from giant floating mechanisms capable of dispersing hurricanes to large solar nets absorbing solar radiation and converting it into energy, to perhaps a large filter within the atmosphere that could suck up greenhouse gases and aid in climate change. This may seem ludicrous at the moment, but go back just 150 years and the concept of an air force and commercial air travel is just as ridiculous. Often in history, some of the most world-changing technologies have their roots in military research. The very computer you're using to watch this video has its roots in the Turing machine, the first electronic computer utilized in World War II to break the Nazis' Enigma code. To wrap it all up, Space Force seems ridiculous, but it has the potential to do a lot of good. Not only is it beneficial to issues of national security, it's a long-term economic investment. But beyond these upfront implications, we must realize that space is the future. The future of our country, the future of our world, perhaps even of humanity. And it is up to us now, America, to, as a past great pioneer of space once said, take that first small step. I'm Rantilla. Thanks for watching.